a man of wealth, a moment of kindness, and a chance encounter that would change everything. Imagine giving money to a stranger, only to find her the next day crying at a grave that means more to you than anything. What connects them? What story lies behind those tears? Today we uncover a chain of events that no one saw coming, a story of unexpected bonds, heartache, and a shocking connection that will leave you breathless. Stay with us to discover how one simple act can turn the past into something entirely unimaginable. The wind was chilly that evening as Jonathan Sinclair, a millionaire known for his successful tech company, pulled his luxury car into a small parking lot beside an unassuming park. He wasn't used to visiting this part of town. The neighborhood was quieter, the houses older, and the streets lined with trees whose branches reached out, creating a canopy over the cracked sidewalks. For Jonathan, life had always moved at a fast pace. Deals, meetings, mergers, everything calculated and controlled. His time as precious as the millions he had earned. But that day, something felt different. He had decided to take a drive, to clear his head, and ended up here, in an unfamiliar place, away from the pressures of his world. Jonathan stepped out of the car, slipping his hands into his coat pockets as he looked around. The late afternoon sun had dipped behind a thick wall of clouds, casting the world in muted gray tones. He was lost in thought as he walked through the park, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound breaking the silence. He hadn't realized how much he needed a break from the chaos of his usual routine. As he walked, he remembered why this place seemed familiar. It wasn't far from the cemetery where he visited once every year, a place where memories lingered and pain resurfaced. He was about to turn back to his car when he noticed her. She was sitting on a bench, her figure hunched over, a worn coat wrapped tightly around her, her face buried in her hands. Even from a distance, Jonathan could see the way her shoulders shook as she cried. He paused for a moment, unsure of whether to approach. He wasn't used to strangers, wasn't accustomed to the discomfort of someone else's pain. It was something he had always avoided. But something about her pulled at him. The closer he got, the more he could see. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, her face pale and streaked with tears, her eyes filled with a sorrow so deep that it made Jonathan's heart clench in his chest. He hesitated, then cleared his throat, making his presence known. She looked up, startled, her eyes wide and glistening. "Are you all right?" Jonathan asked, his voice softer than he'd intended. The woman wiped her face, nodding quickly, as though embarrassed by her tears. "I'm fine," she said, her voice shaky. But her appearance said otherwise, the exhaustion etched into her features, the threadbare coat, the hint of hopelessness in her eyes. Jonathan didn't know why, but he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He pulled out a few bills, folding them in half before extending them to her. "Here," he said, "get yourself something to eat, maybe a place to stay for the night." She looked at the money, her lips parting slightly in surprise. She hesitated, and for a moment Jonathan thought she might refuse. But then she reached out, her fingers brushing against his as she took the bills, her eyes filling with tears once again. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Jonathan gave her a small nod, unsure of what else to say. He wasn't one for emotional exchanges, and the depth of her gratitude left him feeling strangely vulnerable. He turned to leave, but as he did, the woman spoke again. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for your kindness." Jonathan paused, then looked back at her, offering her a small smile. "Jonathan," he replied simply. He walked away, feeling a strange sense of heaviness settle in his chest, a mixture of empathy and a deep, lingering sadness that he couldn't quite place. The next day, Jonathan found himself restless. He had work to do, but he couldn't seem to focus. The image of Clara sitting on that bench, her eyes filled with tears, kept coming back to him. He didn't understand why it bothered him so much. He had helped people before, made donations, funded charities. But this felt different. There was something about her pain that resonated with him. something that made him feel connected to her in a way that he couldn't quite explain. By late afternoon, Jonathan decided to take a drive again. He wasn't entirely sure where he was headed, but his heart seemed to know. Before long, he found himself driving towards the cemetery, the same place he visited every year on the anniversary of her death. He pulled into the cemetery's small gravel lot, the familiar ache in his chest growing stronger. It had been years since he lost her, the woman who had meant everything to him. His fiancée, the love of his life. Emily had been his anchor, the one person who had seen him for who he truly was, beyond the money, beyond the success. Losing her had shattered him, and though he had built his life back up, the emptiness she left behind had never quite healed. As Jonathan walked through the rows of headstones, the chill in the air seemed to seep into his bones. He approached her grave slowly, the weight of his grief pressing down on him, but as he neared the spot where she lay, he froze. Someone was already there. It was Clara. She was kneeling before Emily's grave, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she cried. The sight of her there, at Emily's grave, made Jonathan's heart stop. How could she possibly know? What connection could she have to Emily? His mind raced, confusion and shock paralyzing him as he watched her, his breath catching in his throat. Clara looked up then, her tear-streaked face turning towards him, her eyes widening in surprise as she saw him standing there. For a moment neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with the weight of unspoken questions. "Why are you here?" Jonathan finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara stood slowly, her eyes filled with a mixture of recognition and sorrow. She looked at the grave, then back at Jonathan, her lips trembling. "I didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know it was her, until I saw her name." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest, his mind struggling to make sense of her words. "You knew Emily?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Clara nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "She saved my life," she whispered. "Years ago when I was just a kid, I was lost, alone, and she took me in. She gave me hope, made me believe that there was good in the world. I never knew what happened to her. I never knew she was gone." Jonathan felt the ground shift beneath him, the world tilting as her words sank in. He had never known this, never known that Emily had touched Clara's life in such a profound way. He looked at Clara, seeing her not as a stranger but as someone who had been a part of Emily's story, a part of her legacy that he had never known. Clara wiped her tears, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief and gratitude as she looked at Jonathan. "When you gave me that money yesterday, I didn't know who you were, but when I saw her name here, I knew. She used to talk about you, you know. She said you were the love of her life." Jonathan felt his chest tighten, his eyes stinging as tears threatened to fall. He had spent so long grieving Emily, so long feeling the emptiness of her absence. But now, standing here with Clara, he felt something shift. It was as if Emily was still here, her love still touching lives, still bringing people together, even after all these years. Slowly, Jonathan stepped closer to Clara, his hand reaching out to rest gently on her shoulder. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you for telling me this. I always wondered if she made a difference, if her kindness lived on. And now I know." Clara looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "She did," she said softly. "She saved me. And because of her, I'm still here." Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, the pain in his chest easing, replaced by a sense of peace. Emily's love had always been his guiding light, and now he saw that it had been a light for others as well. He opened his eyes, looking at Clara, a sense of purpose filling him. "Come on," he said gently, his voice filled with warmth. "Let's get out of here. I want to hear more about Emily, about what she meant to you." Clara nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. Together they turned away from the grave, walking side by side towards the car. Jonathan knew that the pain of losing Emily would never fully fade. But now, he also knew that her love had not ended with her death. It had continued, living on in the lives she had touched and the kindness she had shown, and now it would continue through him and Clara. Two strangers brought together by the memory of a woman who had believed in love, in hope, in the power of kindness. And as they walked away, Jonathan felt a sense of peace settle over him, a sense of closure that he had been searching for all these years. Emily was gone, but her love remained, woven into the fabric of his life, and now into Clara's as well. And that, he realized, was more than enough. The next few days were unlike anything Jonathan could have imagined. He spent time with Clara, listening to her stories about Emily, hearing details about her fiancé's past that he'd never known. Clara's tales brought Emily back to life for him, painting a picture of her kindness, her warmth, and her desire to help others that only deepened Jonathan's admiration for the woman he had lost. The pain of losing Emily was still there, but now there was a new sense of comfort, knowing she had lived a life that was meaningful, one that had made a real difference. Clara had struggled for years after Emily's death. She had no family, no real support system. Emily had been her savior, her hope in the darkest of times, and when she disappeared from her life, it had been like a light going out. Jonathan learned that Clara had bounced between shelters, had lost herself in despair, and had finally ended up on the streets. It had been a painful journey, one filled with heartbreak, loneliness, and a constant struggle for survival. As Jonathan listened, he felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. He had spent years living in luxury, moving on with his life while someone Emily had cared for deeply had been suffering. He realized that he had been so caught up in his own grief that he had forgotten that Emily's death hadn't just affected him, it had left a void in the lives of others too. One evening, Clara sat at Jonathan's kitchen table, a cup of tea cradled between her hands. She looked around his spacious penthouse, her eyes wide with wonder. "I never imagined I'd be here," she said softly. "I used to dream about a life like this, a life where I didn't have to worry about where I'd sleep or what I'd eat. But for so long, it just seemed impossible." Jonathan watched her, his heart aching as he took in her words. He had spent his life working for success, for wealth, but in this moment he realized just how meaningless all of it was if it didn't help others. Emily had understood that. She had always seen beyond the money, beyond the success. She had always been about people, about connection, about love. Clara's presence had changed something in Jonathan. He felt a need to do more, to help her rebuild her life, to be the kind of person Emily would have wanted him to be. He offered her a job at the cafe he had recently invested in, a small, cozy place that Emily had loved visiting. It wasn't much, but it was a start, an opportunity for Clara to get back on her feet, to have something to hold on to. The first day at the cafe, Clara was nervous. She had never worked in a place like this before, never interacted with customers, never felt the pressure of having responsibilities. But Jonathan was there, guiding her, introducing her to the staff, helping her settle in. He watched as she slowly began to find her rhythm, her confidence growing with each passing day. The cafe was small, but it was warm and welcoming, the kind of place where people came to relax, to enjoy a good cup of coffee and a conversation with friends. Clara began to make friends, to build connections, and Jonathan could see the change in her. She was smiling more, her eyes brighter, her laughter more frequent. It was as if she was coming back to life, piece by piece. One afternoon, as Jonathan sat at a corner table, watching Clara chat with a customer, he felt a sense of pride that he hadn't felt in a long time. He had spent so much of his life focused on business, on making money, on building his empire. But now, watching Clara, he realized that this, helping someone find their way, giving them hope, this was what truly mattered. It was what Emily had always believed in, and he was finally starting to understand it. But as the days turned into weeks, Jonathan began to notice something else. Clara was thriving, yes, but there was still a sadness in her eyes, a heaviness that she carried with her. He knew that the pain of losing Emily was still there, just as it was for him. And he also knew that there was something else, something that Clara wasn't telling him. One evening, as they closed up the cafe, Jonathan turned to Clara, his eyes filled with concern. "Clara," he said softly, "I can see that there's something bothering you. You've been through so much, and I know it's not easy. But if there's anything you need to talk about, I'm here." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, her expression one of vulnerability. She hesitated, then took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is something," she said, her voice trembling. "Something I've been too afraid to tell you." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with possibilities. He reached out, his hand gently resting on her arm. "Whatever it is, you can tell me," he said softly. "I promise I'll be here for you." Clara closed her eyes for a moment, then looked at him, her eyes filled with pain. "When Emily took me in, she was pregnant," she said, her voice breaking. "She was going to have a baby, but she never got the chance to tell you. She was afraid of what it might mean for your future, for your career. She wanted to wait until the right time, and then she was gone." Jonathan felt the world tilt beneath him, his vision blurring as her words sank in. Pregnant. Emily had been pregnant. He had never known, had never even imagined that she had been carrying their child. The pain that surged through him was like a knife to the heart, a grief so raw and deep that it took his breath away. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with tears, his voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I would have given up everything for her, for our child." Clara shook her head, her own tears falling freely. "She loved you, Jonathan. She loved you so much. She didn't want to hold you back, didn't want you to feel trapped. She thought she had more time. Time to tell you, time to figure everything out. But then she was gone, and I didn't know what to do." Jonathan closed his eyes, his heart shattering as he thought of everything he had lost. Emily, their child, the future they could have had together. He had spent so long grieving her, but now, knowing this, the pain was almost unbearable. He had lost not just the love of his life, but the family they could have had, the life they could have built together. But as he looked at Clara, standing there with tears in her eyes, he also felt something else. Gratitude. Gratitude that Emily had been there for Clara, that she had made a difference in her life, that Clara was still here to carry on her memory. He reached out, pulling Clara into a hug, his arms wrapping around her tightly. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you for telling me, for keeping her memory alive. I don't know what I would have done if I had never known." Clara clung to him, her tears soaking into his shirt. "I'm so sorry, Jonathan," she whispered. "I wish things had been different. I wish she was still here." Jonathan nodded, his own tears falling freely. "So do I," he said softly. "But she's still with us, Clara. In everything we do, in every act of kindness, in every moment we choose to live with love. She's still here." They stood there, holding each other, the weight of their shared grief pressing down on them. It wasn't easy, and it never would be. But in that moment, Jonathan knew that they would find a way to move forward. Together. They would honor Emily's memory, they would carry on her legacy, and they would find a way to heal. The next day, Jonathan made a decision. He wanted to do something meaningful, something that would honor Emily's memory and the child they had lost. He approached Clara with the idea, a scholarship fund, one that would help young people who were struggling, just as Clara had been. It would be in Emily's name, a way to keep her spirit alive, a way to give others the chance at a better life. Clara's eyes filled with tears as she listened, her heart swelling with gratitude. "She would have loved that," she said softly. "She always believed in helping others, in making the world a better place. This would mean so much to her." Jonathan nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "Then let's do it," he said. "Let's make sure that her love, her kindness lives on." Let's give others the chance that she gave you." And so, they began. Together they worked to create the scholarship fund, reaching out to the community, to friends, to anyone who would listen. The response was overwhelming. People who had known Emily, who had been touched by her kindness, came forward, eager to be a part of something that would honor her memory. The cafe became the center of their efforts, a place where people gathered to support the cause, to share stories of Emily, to celebrate her life. It was hard work, but it was also healing. Jonathan found a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years, a sense of connection to the woman he had lost. And Clara, too, found her place. She was no longer alone, no longer lost. She was part of something bigger, something meaningful, something that gave her hope. Together, they were building something beautiful, something that would ensure that Emily's love lived on, touching lives, making a difference. It wasn't the life Jonathan had once imagined for himself, but it was a life filled with purpose, with love, with the memory of the woman who had brought them together. And as they stood in the cafe, surrounded by friends and supporters, Jonathan knew that this was just the beginning. They had faced their grief, they had found each other, and now they were building a future that honored the past while embracing the possibilities of tomorrow. Weeks turned into months, and the scholarship fund in Emily's name began to flourish. Jonathan and Clara worked tirelessly, each day bringing new challenges and new victories. The cafe had become the heart of the community, a place where people came not only to drink coffee but to feel a sense of belonging. It was here that the scholarship was first announced, and over time, it became a beacon of hope for those who felt lost and without a path. The day of the first scholarship award ceremony arrived, and the cafe was filled with warmth and celebration. The community had gathered, everyone eager to see the fruition of Jonathan and Clara's hard work. Clara stood at the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she glanced around the room. This was for Emily, she reminded herself. Every part of this was for her, for the woman who had given her hope when she needed it the most. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice carrying over the quiet hum of conversation. He spoke about Emily, about her kindness, her generosity, her belief in the power of love. As he spoke, his eyes scanned the room, catching Clara's gaze, giving her a small nod of encouragement. He knew how much this day meant to her, to both of them, and he wanted her to know that she wasn't alone. Today, we honor Emily's memory by giving others the chance she never got. We're giving hope, opportunity, and a future to those who need it most, Jonathan said, his voice filled with emotion. This scholarship is more than just money. It's a promise that no one is alone, that there is always someone willing to help, to stand by your side. As he spoke, Clara felt her heart swell with emotion. She remembered the cold nights she had spent alone, the hopelessness that had once threatened to consume her. She remembered Emily, her smile, her warmth, and she knew that this was exactly what Emily would have wanted. The applause that followed Jonathan's speech filled the cafe, a wave of support and love that was almost overwhelming. After the ceremony, the cafe was bustling with people, each one eager to share their congratulations and support. Clara moved through the crowd, accepting hugs and kind words, her heart full. But as the evening began to wind down, she noticed a man standing at the back of the cafe, his eyes fixed on her. He was tall, with a worn jacket and tired eyes, his hands tucked into his pockets. Clara felt a strange sense of familiarity as she approached him, her brow furrowing slightly. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice gentle. The man looked at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. Sadness, regret, hope. "Clara," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "It's me. It's David." Clara's heart stopped, her breath catching in her throat. David. The name echoed in her mind, bringing back memories she had long buried. David was her brother, the brother she hadn't seen in over a decade, the brother she had lost when her family had fallen apart. She had searched for him, had hoped to find him, but he had vanished, leaving her alone to fend for herself. Tears filled Clara's eyes as she looked at him, her voice trembling. David, she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. Is it really you? David nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. I've been looking for you, he said, his voice breaking. I heard about the scholarship, about the cafe, and I knew it had to be you. I had to come. I had to see you. Clara felt her knees go weak, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his arm, to make sure he was real. I thought you were gone, she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and hope. I thought I'd never see you again. David shook his head, his own tears falling. I'm so sorry, Clara. I got lost. I didn't know how to find you, but I never stopped looking. And now, here you are. The two of them stood there, tears streaming down their faces, the weight of years of separation pressing down on them. Clara pulled David into a hug, her arms wrapping tightly around him as she cried into his shoulder. I've missed you so much, she whispered, her voice breaking. I've missed you every single day. David held her close, his own tears soaking into her hair. I'm here now, he whispered. I'm not going anywhere. Jonathan watched from a distance, his heart swelling as he saw Clara reunited with her brother. He could see the emotion in her eyes, the way her entire being seemed to light up in that moment. It was as if a missing piece of her had finally fallen into place, and Jonathan couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and happiness for her. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions for Clara. She spent every spare moment with David, catching up on the years they had lost, sharing stories of their lives, of the struggles they had faced, of the hope they had found. David had been through his own hardships, years of living on the streets, of trying to survive, of feeling lost and alone. But now they had found each other again, and they were determined not to let go. Jonathan watched from the sidelines, giving Clara the space she needed to reconnect with her brother. He saw the way her eyes shone with happiness, the way her laughter filled the cafe, the way she seemed lighter, freer. It was as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, and Jonathan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what Emily would have wanted. This was the kind of love, the kind of connection that she had always believed in. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonathan sat with Clara and David at the cafe, the three of them sharing a quiet moment together. Clara looked at Jonathan, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. Thank you for everything, for helping me find my way, for giving me hope, for helping me find David. Jonathan smiled, his heart swelling with love for this woman who had become such an important part of his life. You don't need to thank me, he said gently. You've done the same for me. You've brought me hope. You've helped me heal. And I'm just glad that I could be here for you. David looked between the two of them, a small smile tugging at his lips. I think Emily would be proud of both of you, he said softly. She'd be proud of what you've built, of the love you've shared. She'd be proud of the way you've chosen to honor her memory. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. She reached out, taking Jonathan's hand in hers, her fingers lacing through his. We're doing this for her, she said softly. For Emily, for everything she believed in. And we're doing it together. Jonathan nodded, his eyes filled with emotion as he looked at Clara, then at David. Together, he agreed. And in that moment, Jonathan knew that this was what he had been searching for all along. Connection, love, hope. It wasn't about the money, the success, the business deals. It was about the people he loved, the people who had become his family. It was about honoring Emily's memory, about carrying on her legacy, about building a future that was filled with love and purpose. As the evening turned into night, the three of them sat together, the warmth of their connection wrapping around them like a blanket. They talked, they laughed, they shared stories, and as the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, Jonathan knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be. The point of no return had come and gone. They had faced their fears, their grief, their pasts. They had found each other. They had found hope, And now, they were building a future that was bright, that was filled with love, that was a testament to the woman who had brought them all together. And as they sat there, surrounded by the warmth of the cafe, the sound of laughter and conversation filling the air, Jonathan knew that this was just the beginning. Together, they would face whatever came next. They would honor Emily's memory, and they would continue to spread her love, her kindness, her light. Because that was what Emily would have wanted, and that was what they would do, together. The days that followed were marked by a renewed sense of hope and a profound commitment to honor Emily's legacy. Jonathan, Clara, and David began working together more closely, each contributing their unique strengths to continue building the scholarship fund and expanding the impact of the cafe. The once small and cozy coffee shop had transformed into a bustling community hub, a place where people not only enjoyed a good cup of coffee but also found support, hope, and the means to change their lives. For Jonathan, life had taken on new meaning. He had always been a man driven by success, by building, expanding, conquering. But now his focus had shifted. He wasn't chasing profits or business deals anymore. He was investing in people, in relationships, in the kind of change that Emily had always believed in. And in doing so, he found himself growing in ways he never imagined possible. One of the biggest transformations was in his relationships with others. Jonathan had always kept people at arm's length, business partners, acquaintances. He was a man who valued control, who thrived on predictability. But Clara and David had shattered those barriers. They had shown him what it meant to truly connect, to be vulnerable, to share both joy and pain with others. The love that had grown between him and Clara was different from what he had known with Emily, but it was no less profound. It was a love built on resilience, on shared loss and shared hope, and Jonathan cherished every moment of it. David, too, found himself changing. After years of living on the fringes of society, struggling to find his place, he had finally found a purpose. He had taken on a role at the cafe, managing inventory, helping with deliveries, and even organizing community events. He was no longer the lost young man who had wandered from place to place searching for something he couldn't quite name. He was part of a family now, a family that needed him, that valued him, that gave him a reason to get up each morning. It wasn't always easy. There were days when the pain of the past resurfaced, days when Clara would find herself overwhelmed by memories of the nights she had spent alone, struggling to survive, or when Jonathan would be hit by the sudden aching emptiness of Emily's absence. There were moments when David would wake up in a cold sweat, the ghosts of his past still haunting him, the fear of losing everything again gnawing at the edges of his newfound happiness. But in those moments they had each other. They had built a support system that was stronger than any one of them alone. When Clara felt overwhelmed, Jonathan was there to hold her, to remind her of her strength, of the difference she was making in the lives of others. When Jonathan was lost in grief, Clara was there to guide him back, her love a steady beacon in the storm of his emotions. And when David's fears threatened to consume him, Clara and Jonathan were there to pull him back, to remind him that he was no longer alone, that he was part of something bigger now. The scholarship fund had grown beyond their wildest expectations. What had started as a small initiative to help a few young people had blossomed into a full-fledged program that was changing lives. They had received support from unexpected places, former colleagues of Emily who had heard about the fund, local businesses that wanted to contribute, people whose lives had been touched by the kindness of a stranger. The impact of Emily's legacy was reaching far beyond what any of them could have imagined, and the sense of purpose it gave them was indescribable. One day, Clara sat down with Jonathan at the kitchen table in the cafe, her eyes filled with excitement. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice tinged with hope. "What if we expanded the scholarship? What if we created a mentorship program to go along with it? We could help these kids not just financially, but also guide them, be there for them, the way Emily was there for me." Jonathan's eyes lit up at her words, a smile spreading across his face. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "That's an incredible idea, Clara. I think Emily would have loved it. She always believed in giving more than just money. She believed in giving her time, her love. And we can do that too. David, who was listening nearby, nodded in agreement. I think it's perfect. These kids need more than just money. They need someone to believe in them, to help them find their way. And we can be those people. And so, they began. The mentorship program took shape slowly at first. Just a few volunteers, a handful of students. But soon it began to grow, drawing in people from all over the community who wanted to be part of something meaningful. Jonathan used his connections to bring in professionals from various fields, people who could offer guidance, advice, and opportunities to the young scholarship recipients. Clara worked tirelessly, organizing events, matching mentors with students, and making sure that each young PE, David too played a crucial role. He had a way of connecting with the students, of understanding their struggles because he had been there himself. One of the students, a young girl named Mia, had been struggling to find her place in the world. She had grown up in foster care, moving from one home to another, never feeling like she belonged anywhere. When she received the scholarship, she was hesitant, afraid to hope, afraid to believe that someone truly cared about her future. But Clara took Mia under her wing, mentoring her, guiding her, showing her that she was capable of so much more than she realized. With Clara's support, Mia began to thrive. She enrolled in college, started pursuing her dream of becoming a social worker, and even began volunteering at the cafe, giving back to the community that had given her so much. Watching Mia grow, seeing the light return to her eyes, was one of the most rewarding experiences of Clara's life. She saw herself in Mia, in the uncertainty, in the fear of being alone, in the desire to find a place to belong. And as she watched Mia blossom, Clara felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She was no longer the lost, broken girl she had once been. She was strong, she was capable, and she was making a difference. And she knew that Emily would be proud. For Jonathan, the mentorship program was a way to give back in a way that was deeply personal. He had spent so much of his life focused on material success, but now he was investing in people, in their dreams, in their potential. He spent hours with the students, sharing his knowledge, helping them navigate their career paths, and, most importantly, showing them that someone believed in them. It was challenging, yes, there were setbacks, there were disappointments, but it was also the most rewarding work he had ever done. David found his own place within the program as well. He connected with the students on a level that was different from Jonathan and Clara. He understood what it was like to feel lost, to feel like there was no way out. He became a mentor to several of the students, sharing his story, offering them hope, showing them that it was possible to overcome even the darkest of times. The bonds he formed with the students were deep and meaningful, and for the first time in a long time, David felt like he truly belonged. As the mentorship program grew, so did the cafe. It became more than just a place to get a cup of coffee. It became a symbol of hope, of community, of love. It was a place where people came to find support, to find connection, to find themselves. And for Jonathan, Clara, and David, it was a place where they could honor Emily's memory every single day. They had come so far from where they had started, from the grief, the pain, the sense of loss that had once consumed them. They had found each other, they had found hope, and they had built something beautiful. They had created a legacy that honored Emily's life, a legacy that was making a real difference in the world. And as they stood together one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange, Jonathan knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be. They had faced their past, they had embraced their pain, and they had turned it into something beautiful. They had found love, they had found purpose, and they had found each other. Emily would be so proud of us, Clara said softly, her voice filled with emotion. Jonathan nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. She would. She believed in love, in kindness, in hope. And that's what we're doing, every single day. David smiled, his heart full as he looked at the two people who had become his family. We're building something that will last, he said. Something that will continue to touch lives, to bring hope, long after we're gone. And as they stood there, their hands intertwined, their hearts filled with love and gratitude. They knew that this was just the beginning. They had faced their fears. They had found each other, and they had built a future that was filled with love, with hope, with the memory of a woman who had brought them all together. They had found their way, and now they were helping others find theirs. And that, Jonathan knew, was the greatest gift of all. The night of the fundraiser had arrived. It was the culmination of months of planning, the kind of grand event that would bring even more visibility to their scholarship fund and mentorship program. The cafe was transformed. Strings of twinkling lights hung from the ceiling, soft music played in the background, and the air was filled with the excited hum of conversation. It felt like magic, like all their hard work was finally paying off, and the community had gathered to celebrate something truly special. Jonathan looked around, feeling a swell of pride. It wasn't just about the success of the fundraiser, it was about the people here, the people who had come together to make a difference. Clara was moving through the crowd, a bright smile on her face as she greeted guests and thanked them for their support. She was radiant, her happiness shining through, and Jonathan's heart swelled with love as he watched her. David was standing by the entrance welcoming people, his easy smile making everyone feel at home. For Jonathan, this night was about more than just raising money. It was about showing the world what they had built, about honoring Emily's memory in the most beautiful way possible. He thought of Emily often, especially at times like this. He could almost see her, standing there with that gentle smile on her face, her eyes filled with warmth and love. And he knew that she would be proud of what they had accomplished, proud of the lives they were changing. As the evening continued, speeches were given, people mingled, and the atmosphere was filled with laughter and hope. Jonathan stood by the stage, waiting for his turn to speak, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nerves. He had never been one for public speaking, but tonight he wanted to do this. For Emily, for Clara, for everyone who had believed in them. Clara made her way to his side, slipping her hand into his, her fingers squeezing his gently. "You're going to do great," she whispered, her eyes filled with encouragement. Jonathan smiled, leaning down to press a soft kiss to her forehead. "Thanks, love," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I just want them to see what we're doing, to really understand what this means." Clara nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "They will," she said. "Just speak from the heart." When Jonathan took the stage, the room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, taking in the faces of those who had come to support them. He spotted David standing near the back, his expression one of pride and support, and Jonathan felt a sense of strength wash over him. "Good evening, everyone," Jonathan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight. This night is about more than just raising funds. It's about celebrating the spirit of community, the power of love, and the legacy of someone who meant the world to me." He paused, his eyes glistening as he thought of Emily. Emily was someone who believed in people. She believed in the power of kindness, of connection. She believed that everyone, no matter their circumstances, deserves a chance at a better life. And it's because of her that we're here tonight. He glanced at Clara, his heart swelling with love. This scholarship fund, this mentorship program, it's all because of her. Because of the love she gave, the hope she inspired, and tonight we're continuing her work. We're making sure that her light continues to shine, that her legacy lives on in the lives of those we're helping. As Jonathan spoke, Clara felt tears fill her eyes, her heart swelling with pride. She looked around the room, taking in the faces of the guests, the students who had received the scholarships, the mentors who had given their time and support. It was overwhelming, in the best way possible, a reminder of just how far they had come, of all they had accomplished together. When Jonathan finished his speech, the room erupted in applause, the sound filling the space, echoing off the walls. Clara's heart swelled as she watched Jonathan step down from the stage, his eyes meeting hers, a smile spreading across his face. He made his way to her, pulling her into his arms, his lips brushing against her ear. "We did it," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "We really did it." Clara nodded, her tears spilling over as she looked up at him. "We did," she said softly, her voice breaking. "And I'm so proud of you, of us, of everything we've done." But just as they shared that moment of triumph, the unexpected happened. David, who had been standing near the entrance, suddenly stumbled forward, his face contorted in pain. Clara's eyes widened in horror as she saw the flash of a blade, the glint of metal catching the light as someone lunged at David. It all happened so quickly, David falling, the crowd gasping, the assailant disappearing into the chaos. "David!" Clara screamed, her heart pounding in her chest, her legs moving before her mind could catch up. She pushed her way through the crowd, her eyes locked on her brother, who lay on the ground, blood seeping through his shirt. Jonathan was right behind her, his face pale, his heart hammering in his chest as he reached David's side. He knelt down, his hands shaking as he pressed them to David's wound, his eyes filled with panic. "Call an ambulance," he shouted, his voice desperate. Clara fell to her knees beside David, her hands trembling as she took his face in her hands. "Stay with me, David," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, stay with me." David's eyes fluttered open, his gaze meeting Clara's, a weak smile tugging at his lips. I'm okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Just a scratch." Clara choked back a sob, her tears falling freely. "You're going to be okay," she said, her voice trembling. "Just hold on. Help is coming." The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. The paramedics arrived, the crowd was pushed back, and Clara and Jonathan watched in helpless agony as David was loaded onto a stretcher, his face pale, his eyes closed. Clara held onto Jonathan, her body trembling, her heart breaking at the sight of her brother lying there, so vulnerable, so still. They followed the ambulance to the hospital, the ride filled with silence, the weight of what had happened pressing down on them. Clara's mind was racing, her thoughts a blur of fear, of anger, of disbelief. Who would do this? Why would someone attack David? It didn't make sense. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, of hope, of love. And now, it had turned into a nightmare. When they arrived at the hospital, they were told to wait, the doctors rushing David into surgery. Clara sat in the waiting room, her hands shaking, her eyes filled with tears. Jonathan sat beside her, his arm around her, his heart aching as he watched her fall apart. He hated this, hated the helplessness, the fear, the uncertainty. He had faced many challenges in his life, but nothing compared to this, to the fear of losing someone he loved, to the knowledge that there was nothing he could do to change what had happened. Hours passed, each one feeling like a lifetime. Clara and Jonathan sat in silence, their hands intertwined, their hearts heavy with fear. Finally, a doctor approached, his face serious, his eyes tired. "Are you family of David?" he asked, his voice gentle. Clara stood, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm his sister," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Is he going to be okay?" The doctor gave her a small, reassuring smile. "He's stable," he said. "The wound was deep, but we were able to repair the damage. He's going to need time to recover, but he's going to be okay." Clara felt her knees give out, her body sagging with relief as Jonathan caught her, his arms wrapping around her tightly. She buried her face in his chest, her tears falling freely, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you." The doctor nodded, his expression softening. "You can see him soon," he said. "He's going to need a lot of rest, but he's a fighter. He'll pull through." As the doctor walked away, Clara looked up at Jonathan, her eyes filled with tears, her heart full of love and relief. "He's okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's going to be okay." Jonathan cupped her face in his hands, his own eyes glistening with tears. "He's strong," he said softly, just like his sister. Clara smiled, her tears spilling over as she leaned into him, her heart swelling with love. They had faced so much: loss, grief, fear. But they had also found each other, found hope, found love. And now, they had faced yet another trial, and they had come out the other side stronger, more determined than ever. As they stood there, holding each other, Clara knew that this was just another chapter in their journey. A journey that was filled with challenges, yes, but also with love, with hope, with the promise of a better tomorrow. They would continue to fight, to build, to honor Emily's memory, and they would do it together. Because that was what love was, facing the darkness together, holding on to each other, and never letting go. The days following David's surgery were some of the hardest Clara and Jonathan had ever faced. The stark white of the hospital walls, the sterile smell, the relentless sound of machines beeping. It was all a constant reminder of how close they had come to losing someone they loved. Clara spent every waking moment by David's side, holding his hand, talking to him, reminding him that he was not alone, that he was loved, that they still had so much to do together. Jonathan was her rock during this time. He made sure Clara ate, made sure she rested when she could, made sure that every need she had was taken care of. He dealt with the authorities, answering their questions about the attack, trying to make sense of why someone would do this. He knew Clara needed to be with David, and he wanted nothing more than to give her that. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, David began to heal. The color returned to his cheeks. His smile started to come back, and with each passing day, the fear that had gripped Clara's heart began to loosen. She watched as David fought his way back, watched as he pushed through the pain, the fatigue, the uncertainty, and she knew this was what it meant to be resilient. This was what it meant to fight for the people you loved. One quiet afternoon, as the sunlight streamed through the hospital window, David looked at Clara, his eyes filled with emotion. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice still hoarse from the ordeal. "You and Jonathan. I don't know how to thank you." Clara smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. She squeezed his hand gently, her heart swelling with love. "You don't need to thank us," she said softly. "We're family, and family takes care of each other." David nodded, his own eyes filling with tears. He looked at Jonathan, who was standing by the door, his expression one of quiet strength. "Thank you," David said, his voice trembling. "For everything. For taking care of Clara. For being here for me." Jonathan walked over, placing a comforting hand on David's shoulder. "You're my family too, David," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I promise, I will always be here for both of you, no matter what." The bond between the three of them had grown stronger than ever, a bond forged through pain, through love, through shared experience. They had faced the darkness together, and they had come out the other side, their love for each other deeper, their commitment to their cause more unwavering than ever. Once David was discharged, the three of them returned home. The cafe, which had been left in the capable hands of their dedicated staff, was bustling, and as soon as they stepped inside, they were met with cheers, applause, and tears of relief from their community. The warmth, the love, the sense of belonging, it all filled Clara's heart, reminding her that they were not alone. They were part of something bigger, something beautiful, something that was changing lives. Jonathan stood beside Clara and David, his heart swelling with pride as he looked around the cafe. The people here, their friends, their neighbors, the scholarship students, the mentors, they were the reason they had kept going. They were the reason they had fought so hard to make a difference. And as he looked into the faces of those who had gathered to welcome them back, he knew that they had created something truly special. The mentorship program continued to grow, the scholarship fund continued to support young people who needed a chance, and the cafe continued to be a place of love, of hope, of community. But more than that, it was a place that honored Emily's memory in every way possible. It was a place where her kindness, her generosity, her belief in people lived on, touching the lives of everyone who walked through its doors. One evening, a few weeks after David's return, Clara, Jonathan, and David sat together at the cafe, the soft glow of the lights casting a warm hue over the room. The day had been long but fulfilling, a day spent working with the students, planning the next big event for the scholarship fund, serving coffee to the regulars, sharing laughter, sharing hope. Clara looked at Jonathan, her heart swelling with love as she took his hand. She looked at David, her brother, her family, her heart full. "We've come so far," she said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. "And I know we still have a long way to go, but I'm so grateful to both of you for everything." Jonathan smiled, lifting her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her fingers. "We've built something beautiful," he said, his voice filled with pride, "and we're just getting started." David nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. "Emily would be so proud of us," he said, his voice breaking. "She'd be so proud of what we've done, of the lives we've touched, of the love we've shared." As they sat there, the three of them together, they knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges, more heartbreak, more moments of doubt. But there would also be more joy, more love, more moments of triumph. They had each other, they had their community, and they had a purpose that gave their lives meaning, that honored the woman who had brought them all together. Clara looked around the cafe, taking in the faces of the people who had become her family, the students who had found hope through the scholarship, the mentors who had given their time, their love, the customers who had supported them every step of the way. This was what they had built. This was what they were fighting for, and it was beautiful. The following week, Clara and Jonathan decided to hold an open day at the cafe, an event where people from the community could come in, learn about the scholarship program, meet the mentors, and hear the stories of the students whose lives had been changed. It was a celebration of everything they had achieved, and a chance to share their vision for the future. The cafe was filled with people, students, mentors, community members, families. There were banners hanging from the ceiling, photos of the scholarship recipients on display, their stories written out for everyone to read. Clara moved through the crowd, her heart swelling with pride as she listened to the conversations around her. People talking about the impact of the program, sharing their own stories of hope and resilience. Jonathan stood by the stage, his eyes scanning the room, a sense of fulfillment washing over him. This was what they had worked so hard for, this sense of community, of belonging, of making a real difference. He caught sight of Clara across the room, her smile radiant as she spoke with one of the students, and his heart swelled with love. She was the heart of this place, the one who had brought them all together, the one who had made all of this possible. David was standing near the entrance greeting people as they arrived, his smile warm and genuine. He had found his place here. He was no longer the lost young man who had wandered from place to place, searching for something he couldn't quite name. He was part of a family now, a family that loved him, that valued him, that gave him a reason to get up each morning. As the event continued, Jonathan took the stage, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and excitement. He had never been one for public speaking, but tonight, he wanted to share their story, to let everyone know just how much this community meant to them. "Good evening, everyone," Jonathan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight. This night is about more than just celebrating our achievements. It's about celebrating the spirit of community, the power of love, and the legacy of someone who meant the world to me." He paused, his eyes glistening as he thought of Emily. Emily was someone who believed in people. She believed in the power of kindness, of connection. She believed that everyone, no matter their circumstances, deserves a chance at a better life. And it's because of her that we're here tonight. He glanced at Clara, his heart swelling with love. This scholarship fund, this mentorship program, it's all because of her. Because of the love she gave, the hope she inspired. And tonight we're continuing her work. We're making sure that her light continues to shine. that her legacy lives on in the lives of those we're helping. The room erupted in applause, the sound filling the space, echoing off the walls. Clara's heart swelled as she watched Jonathan step down from the stage, his eyes meeting hers, a smile spreading across his face. He made his way to her, pulling her into his arms, his lips brushing against her ear. "We did it," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "We really did it." Clara nodded, her tears spilling over as she looked up at him. "We did," she said softly, her voice breaking. "And I'm so proud of you. Of us. Of everything we've done." The night continued, the cafe filled with laughter, with stories, with hope. People shared their experiences, their dreams, their gratitude for the opportunities they had been given. And as Clara looked around, she knew that they had created something truly special, something that would continue to grow, to touch lives, to bring hope. As the evening drew to a close, Clara, Jonathan, and David stood together, their hearts full, their spirits light. They had faced the darkness, they had found the light, and now they were building a future that was filled with love, with hope, with the memory of the woman who had brought them all together. They were stronger than ever, more determined than ever, more in love with each other and with the life they had built. And they knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Because that was what family did. They faced the darkness, they celebrated the light, and they held on to each other, through everything. As the evening turned into night, Clara, Jonathan, and David sat together, their hearts full, their spirits light. They had built something beautiful, something lasting, something that would continue to touch lives, to bring hope, to spread love. And they knew that this was only the beginning. Together they would continue to honor Emily's legacy, to build a future that was bright, that was filled with hope, that was a testament to the love that had brought them all together. And as they looked toward the future, they knew that anything was possible, because they had each other and that was all they needed. Several years had passed since the day Jonathan, Clara, and David stood in the cafe, embracing the future they had committed to building together. The world had kept turning as it always does, bringing with it new challenges, new opportunities, and new joys. The mentorship program had grown beyond anything they had ever imagined. What began as a small initiative to provide scholarships and guidance had blossomed into a fully fledged organization, with branches in neighboring towns and partnerships with other communities. The cafe, too, had evolved. What had once been a simple neighborhood spot had turned into a cornerstone of the community, a place not only for delicious food and warm drinks, but also for gatherings, support groups, art exhibitions, and charity events. It had become a beacon of light, a place where people came to be heard, to belong and to thrive. Clara often found herself standing behind the counter, watching as people entered and left, carrying pieces of hope with them. Jonathan continued to play his part, often taking a more hands-on role in the expansion of their outreach programs. He was deeply committed to ensuring that their initiatives made a difference, not just in the lives of the young people they worked with, but in the entire community. The once shy and hesitant public speaker had grown into a leader who inspired not just by words, but by his actions. He had poured his heart and soul into every project, knowing that he was honoring the legacy of the woman who had first taught him what love and community meant. On a crisp fall morning, Clara stood at the window of her office above the cafe, watching the golden leaves swirl in the gentle breeze. It was a special day, the 10th anniversary of the scholarship program's inception. She looked down at the square, bustling with people who had come to celebrate this milestone. Her heart swelled with pride as she saw the faces of those whose lives had been touched by their work, the students who had gone on to become doctors, teachers, and artists, the mentors who had dedicated their time and energy, the families whose hope had been restored. Clara turned as she heard a knock on the door, and Jonathan walked in, a warm smile on his face. He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her, kissing her temple gently. "It's time," he said softly, his voice filled with excitement. Clara nodded, her eyes shining with emotion as she looked up at him. "I can't believe it's been 10 years, she whispered. It feels like just yesterday we were trying to figure out how to make all of this work." Jonathan chuckled, his eyes filled with love. "And look at what we've done. Together. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Clara smiled, leaning into him for a moment before pulling back. "Let's go," she said, her voice filled with determination. "There are a lot of people waiting for us." Together, they made their way downstairs, where David was already speaking to the crowd, his voice carrying over the noise of the gathered community. He stood on the small stage, his presence confident and calm. He had found his calling in public speaking, using his experiences to connect with others and inspire them. He had come a long way from the broken young man they had once feared for, and today, as Clara watched him speak, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. David's speech was heartfelt and sincere, filled with anecdotes of the challenges they had faced, the people they had helped, and the dreams they had seen realized. He spoke about Emily, and how her kindness and her love had been the seed that had grown into something so much bigger than any of them had imagined. He spoke about Jonathan and Clara, and their unwavering dedication to the cause, their courage, and their love for each other and for their community. As David finished, the crowd erupted in applause, and Clara felt her heart swell. She stepped onto the stage beside Jonathan, taking David's hand and squeezing it gently. Jonathan took a deep breath, stepping forward to address the crowd, his voice steady. "Thank you everyone for being here today," he began, his eyes sweeping over the gathered faces. "Today, we're not just celebrating 10 years of the scholarship program. We're celebrating a decade of love, of hope, of resilience. We're celebrating each and every one of you, because without this community, without your belief in what we were trying to do, none of this would have been possible." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she listened to Jonathan speak, her heart swelling with love and pride. He spoke about their journey, about the obstacles they had overcome, the lives they had touched, and the dreams they had seen come to life. He spoke about Emily, about her unwavering belief in the goodness of people, and about how they had all worked to carry that belief forward. "And today," Jonathan continued, his voice breaking slightly, "we are proud to announce that we are expanding our scholarship program even further. We are partnering with other communities, other organizations, to make sure that every young person, no matter where they come from, has a chance to follow their dreams. We are committed to making sure that the legacy of love and hope that Emily started continues to grow, to touch more lives, to bring more light to the world." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Clara felt tears spill down her cheeks as she looked out at the crowd. She saw the faces of the students they had helped, the mentors who had supported them, the families who had been changed by their work, and she knew that they were doing something truly important, something that would outlast them, something that would continue to grow and thrive long after they were gone. As the event continued, Clara, Jonathan, and David moved through the crowd, talking to people, sharing stories, and hearing about the impact their work had had. Clara spoke with a young woman who had just completed her first year of medical school, her education made possible by one of their scholarships. She spoke with a mentor who had been with them since the beginning, who shared how much the program had enriched her own life. She listened to the parents of a young boy who had just been accepted into the mentorship program, their voices filled with hope for his future. Jonathan found himself speaking with one of the local business owners, a man who had been one of their earliest supporters. The man spoke about how proud he was to see how far they had come, how proud he was to be a part of something so meaningful. Jonathan smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. He knew that they couldn't have done any of this alone. It had taken a community, a family, to make all of this possible. As the sun began to set, the event slowly wound down. The lights strung across the square twinkled as the evening grew darker, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Clara, Jonathan, and David stood together on the stage once more, looking out at the people who had become their family. Clara took a deep breath, her voice filled with emotion as she spoke. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said softly. "Thank you for believing in us, for supporting us, for helping us build something that is so much more than any of us could have imagined. This is just the beginning. We have so much more to do, so many more lives to touch, and we are so grateful to have all of you by our side." David nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. Emily's dream was to make the world a better place, to bring hope to those who needed it most. And I think today, we've done just that. But we're not done yet. We're going to keep going. We're going to keep building. We're going to keep fighting for every young person who needs a chance. And we're going to do it together. Jonathan smiled, his heart swelling with love as he looked at Clara and David, and then out at the crowd. "This is our family," he said softly, "and I couldn't be prouder." The crowd erupted in applause once more, the sound echoing off the buildings, filling the square with warmth and love. Clara looked at Jonathan and David, her heart full, her spirit light. They had come so far, and she knew that they still had a long way to go. But they had each other, they had their community, and they had a purpose that gave their lives meaning, that honored the memory of the woman who had brought them all together. And as they stood there, hand in hand, surrounded by the people they loved, they knew that this was just the beginning. Together they would continue to build, to grow, to love, to bring hope to those who needed it most. And they knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Because that was what family did. They faced the darkness, they celebrated the light, and they held on to each other. Through every challenge, through every triumph, through every moment of doubt and every moment of joy. And as the stars began to twinkle above, casting their gentle light over the square, Clara, Jonathan, and David knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be. They had built something beautiful, something lasting, something that would continue to grow and thrive and bring hope for years to come. And as they looked toward the future, they knew that anything was possible, because they had each other, and that was all they needed.